In this chapter, we will speak about how you can make local API calls with the use of the CyberArk API Gateway. What is the API Gateway? The API Gateway allows you to run local API calls by the use of a gateway that you install on your local network. So this means that you can make an API call from the cloud, from anywhere, over CyberArk Identity with the API Gateway to any on-prem or local API endpoint that may be available. In this tutorial, I will demonstrate how you can make an REST API call to an on-premise CyberArk Privileged Access Management installation. I'm going to list all saves, for example, without the need to expose the CyberArk on-premise PAM APIs over the internet. So what will happen? We will create an application in CyberArk Identity which allows to configure what kind of local API endpoint or path you would like to call. So what you see here is a CyberArk Privileged Access Management on-premise installation, and I'm going to authenticate or log in to the portal with my administrator account with a local CyberArk administrator account. That works fine. What I like to do now, and I'm going to use Postman first to give the example, I'm going to run an authentication, a CyberArk authentication endpoint call, a REST API call to log on to the portal from Postman. There are various methods to log on to the CyberArk portal, but I'm going to use in my case the CyberArk method. So you also have Windows and LDAP and Radius. So here in Postman, I'm using the CyberArk logon, and I have to provide a certain payload in the body, a JSON formatted one that includes the username and the password. Upon success, you will be returned a token that you can use for further calls against the vault. This token will be valid for 20 minutes, by the way. So I'm going to make that same API endpoint call, but then from or via CyberArk Identity API Gateway from the cloud on a local machine. To be able to do so, you need to have installed the API Gateway in your network, and ideally even multiple ones for redundancy purposes. This is something that you install on a Windows machine, and that has the capability to reach the local endpoint. So, to install that connector, you can go to the admin portal from CyberArk Identity, and in the downloads section, you will find the connectors. You can simply download that connector on your server, your Windows machine, and run the application, install the application. Once that's done, you can find the configuration for the connector in the Windows folder. So here you can see the server name comp1, you can see what identity it is connected to, and you can see that it is successful, the software is up to date, and it ran recently. Now, in the admin portal for identity, you will find which connectors are installed and registered with our service. And it is important that one of them is running the App Gateway service. This is definable, what kind of role a connector plays. If you click on the connector and you choose actions, and you can see that you can disable or enable the service that this connector has available. For example, my DC1 has no application gateway, as you can see here. It's not in the list. So I'm going to select my DC1, and in the actions I can now say enable the application gateway. If I click on yes, then it will register this service also for that gateway, and now I've got two connectors installed that have the application gateway functionality available. Now let's configure a web application to be able to call that endpoint. To do so, we go to the Add Web Apps. In the Custom tab, you will find the API. Add this to your web apps and save it. We need to do a number of configurations. We need to give it a name. This can be any name. I'm going to call it PAM Self-Hosted API or REST. And now we have to do some application settings. This will be the path to the local URL for the endpoint call. So in my case, that's going to be comp01.cyber.com, which is the PVWA path for my REST API locally. So let's fill it in here, comp01.cyber.com, and save this. Okay, now the API gateway, let's make this application available over the internet. That's what we'd like to do. We'd like to be able from the cloud to make a REST API call locally. So there are a number of settings that you need to configure. In my case, I'm going to use a CyberArk generated external URL. There's also the possibility, for example, to work with SSL certificates, but in my case, I'm going to use this path. So this generated URL is the example that you see here. So that will be the public available endpoint path to call. So this is something that we generate per application. It requires to provide a header with a certain name, Cyber access token. And that access token is something that we will generate as well from our interface, the admin interface. And that will be required to be allowed to run this endpoint call. Without this, anyone could do this. So you need to have certain security in place. Okay, so let's generate an API key. Click on the add button and give it any name. I'm going to use API key, and for the description, exactly what I'm saying here, what I just explained. This is the key that we will require to provide with the endpoint call to that path that we've generated. And this is to authenticate against CyberArk identity. Obviously, we'd like to have security in place so that no one just at random can make an endpoint call to this specific endpoint. Under the REST API, I'm going to add a .star. That means that I'm allowed to run any endpoint call, so we could limit this if we'd like. And now it's generating a key. This will only be available while generating this, so you have to copy it. And in my case, I'm going to place it into a secure node in my CyberArk identity. Should just give it a name for me to remember. Some notes here. To authenticate the endpoint. And I'm going to add a custom field, API key. And just save that value of the key that we've just generated in this field. So keeping it for later use. Okay. Our configuration is now ready. There are a few other options that you can set and configure. You can read the documentation if you like. You can define which connector you will use for this endpoint call. In my case, I'm going to choose specifically the comp1 because I know the PVWA is running on there, but you can have CyberArk identity choosing from any available connector. Okay. Now this is saved, and we can see now here the PAM SH REST web application to be available. Okay, let's take a look at this again. So we can see the application settings, the API gateway that we've configured, and so on. Back to web apps, I'm not going to make any changes here, so I'm not going to save it. Now I'm going to go to Visual Studio. I'm using Thunder as an API endpoint client, and I'm going to create a new request. So in this request, I'm going to give it a name, get CyberArk or self-hosted PAM token, because that's the first thing that I would like to do. I would like to retrieve a token from the vault that I can use in further API calls. So I'm going to call it get PAM self-hosted token. Okay, the URL that I'm going to provide here. The first part of the URL will be that URL that we have generated. Normally for Postman here, we would use the comp1, CyberArk 1, and so on. For further endpoint calls, we would use, of course, the same thing, including the token that we have received. So if I would like to list all sales, for example, then I would require that token that I've received and the path to the endpoint call. But we have generated our own endpoint from identity. And that's exactly what you will find here. Remember that we set in the application settings, in the API gateway, use CyberArk external URL. So that will be the first part. This will replace, in my case, the comp01.cyber.com. So that's what I need to start with. Now I need to provide a relative path. In my case, for the local CyberArk authentication, I also need to provide a body, and this is the path that I'm going to use. So let's copy this to clipboard first and paste it behind that link, that API endpoint, but let's take away that first part. So I'm having now the endpoint that was generated. I also need to provide or to give my API key that we've generated in the header, and the header has to be called x-cyber-access.token. So remember that I've saved this in my secure node. I'm going to copy it here from my secure node, and that's the API key that was generated when we added this API key. I'm going to pass that in here. Okay. Now I also need to do whatever is required for the last part of the REST API endpoint call. So if I go back to the documentation, then you can see that we need to provide, we need to do a post method, and we need to provide a body that contains the username and the password to authenticate against CyberArk Previous Access Management self-hosted in my case. So let me modify this JSON here a little bit. I don't need the new password. And I need to change the username to the username administrator in my case, with the password CyberArk1. Okay, done. So now we have the header in place. We have the body in place that's required for the endpoint. So that's depending upon the endpoint configuration, of course. And the first part of the API call is what we have generated in the app. So that JSON is required for that logon. Okay, let's click on send here. Method not allowed. Okay, this had to be a post, of course. Let's try this again. And now we can see that it is returning a token, and that token I will require to provide in the next API calls that I make against this self-hosted PAM. Let's see what kind of example will we use. Maybe something with accounts, like get all the accounts, or something that's quite easy to do. Maybe saves. Maybe we can list all saves as an example. Okay, saves, and we have here get all saves. Okay. And we are going to use a second generation app. Okay, so this will be the endpoint call to make. Let's make a new call. I'm going to add a new request, and I will give it the name get PAM self-hosted saves. For the endpoint to call, again, this needs to be the path that we have created, the one that we have created with the CyberArk identity app. And as the path behind this endpoint call, so that's the endpoint, now we need the path as well. It has to be a get method, and we need that part here, the password vault / API saves. Okay, pass that here after that call. Now for the header parameters, again, we will need to provide this x-cyber-access token. That's something that you will need to provide every time when you call this endpoint, because at the end, you're calling the endpoint from CyberArk identity, and you need to authenticate against identity. So I'm going to copy this quickly from my previous endpoint call. Okay. Now let's see in the documentation what else we have to provide for this endpoint call. We have to provide a header parameter with authorization that needs to contain the token that we've received back from the previous call. So I'm going to add a header here, authorization, and I'm going to copy and paste the token that I've received. But without the quotes. The quotes were not part of the token, of course. And let's see in the documentation if there's something else that I need to provide. I don't think that I need to provide a body. I don't need to provide the username anymore for sure. But let's look at the documentation. So header parameters. Let's see if the body requires something. No, the body does not require anything. So this should work. Let's send. Let's see. Okay, send. And now, as you can see, it has returned all the saves. In other words, we were able to use or to connect an internal API endpoint over the use of the API gateway, now available also for flows. Because the endpoint is publicly available, it's sitting in the cloud. Obviously, you require this authorization with the header that we have to provide. But that means from now on, we can also manage or access that endpoint with flows. So let's do that. Okay, so I'm here now in flows. I'm going to create a new flow. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to choose from connectors, my connectors, and I'm going to create a new endpoint call. I don't need any authorization because that's what I will provide in the header, not necessarily with an authorization that I've set up for other things. But I need to provide, of course, the host name. And the host name is something that I will get here from the previous calls that I made. So this piece is what needs to go in the host name without the HTTPS in front of it, because it's done by the scheme that you select, and by default it's HTTPS. And of course we need to change the hello world here as well. Let's see if I have a trailing slash. No, I don't. Okay. So I'm going to copy that also from here. CyberArk password vault API login. In the path, and it needs to be a post method. And now I also need to provide a few other parameters like a header parameter. I'm going to start with the header, which was called x dash cyber dash access dash token. Okay, clicking here on that gear icon, and now I can fill it in. So I'm going to copy that as well from the header here. And I'm going to store that in here. Okay. So for the call itself, for the authentication, I also needed a body. And that body was actually called body. I'm going to save this. Administrator and password CyberArk. In my case, now I can switch to the boat. Okay, yeah. So I got now my body. I've got the access token that I had to provide, and I believe that I've got everything correctly in the host name and the path as well. It's a post method. We should be good. So I could name this a little bit different. PAM self-hosted, for example, and I'm going to call this get token, get auth token, and the company name is CyberArk. And I'm going to use PAM just to make my life easier. And let's save this and run it. By filling in all these details, by the way, under my connectors here, if I refresh, let me quickly refresh here, my connectors, you will find now the CyberArk PAM. That's because of the name that or the company name that I gave it. And this was the API collection that I created, and the get auth token is now this endpoint. So now we can simply reuse this in the future with the parameters that I've used in these settings here. But let's run this. Let's see if this is successful. Response. And as you can see now, I have here a body with a token that I received from previous access management. And this token I can now reuse for further calls that I would like to make against PAM. And remember, by the way, this is valid for about 20 minutes. So let me make the next call to list all safes. Hostname will be the same. Copy and paste that here. The path will be different, of course, that I'm going to get from my previous call that I made here, which is this part. And it needs a slash in front of it, by the way, not using the base path. This was a get method, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. Okay. And I need to provide, of course, also the mapping. It requires the header, which was called x-cyber access token. And that's the same as the one that I used in this call, of course, so I could copy it from here. Copy this. Go back to the mapping and fill it in. It also requires a header, so let's take a look at the documentation, like we've seen previously. In the documentation, we could see for the get saves that it required this header parameter with the name authorization, which needs to contain that token that we've just received. So I'm going to, it's a header parameter with name authorization. And now I need to fill this in. So this is the value that we've received from that previous API call. Now, if I would just say here, I would like to paste in the body, then this will fail. And I will show you why this will fail. So if I run this, and I take a look at the results for the second call, then we can see in the response that it's saying 401, so something is wrong. Session token missing is invalid or expired. The reason why this is because I've provided the authorization, and you can see that Flows is automatically escaping the quote signs in front of the body from the previous call. So we need to remove from the previous call these quotes because it's now replacing them, escaping them at the beginning and at the end. And that's not what we require, of course. So how can we do this? Let's go back to our flow. Let's remove the authorization, the body here. And let's use a formula. And let's use the replace all of formula. And what I'm going to do here is, as the base string, of course, I'm going to use the body that was returned from the previous API call. And I'm going to search for the quotes, and I'm going to replace it with nothing. And that's what I add here. So now we're going to replace all quotes with nothing. Let's try this again. flow is running. It takes a little longer, so this could have worked. Let's take a look at the results. Response 200. And if I look now at the body, then I can see a count of 12 and an array with all the safe number stuff. So that worked. So this replace all function helped me to remove the quote characters from that header. Okay, so this is a way how you can work with self-hosted PAM over the API gateway. I hope this is helpful. By the way, like I said, the token that you receive back will expire every 20 minutes, but every time you make a call, you actually get a new token, so you don't have to worry about this. You could also set up a scheduled task that runs maybe every 15 minutes and store it, for example, in a data store, and then you can use it from there if you like. But that's up to you. And the whole idea or the goal for this tutorial was to show you how you can work with the CyberArk Identity API Gateway to make API calls into your organization without the need to expose your APIs for your application to the internet.